Martin crouched beside the chaise, his fingers brushing the cuff of Rohan's smoking jacket. The velvet felt damp, not from the rain outside, but from a moisture that had soaked through the fabric hours ago. He ran his thumb over the cuff, feeling a faint grit that did not belong on clean clothing. It was a fine white powder, almost invisible against the dark blue weave. He was wet when he came in, Martin said, standing up and looking at the window seals. They were tight, the rubber gaskets compressed perfectly against the frame. No air could pass through without leaving a trace of condensation or disturbance. But the room is dry everywhere else. He moved to the door, testing the lock mechanism with a small tool from his kit. The tumblers clicked with a satisfying snap, engaging fully into the deadbolt. This was locked from the inside, he said, turning back to face Tanya and Meera, and no one could have opened it without breaking the seal. He pointed to the threshold where the floor met the door frame. There were no scuff marks, no signs of a forced entry or a master key used in haste. The geometry of the room made no sense. A man dead from poison sealed behind a locked door, with no Meera stepped closer, her eyes darting toward the balcony where the storm raged. The service staff said Vikram was here, she stated, her voice rising in pitch just enough to betray her anxiety. He wanted the promotion. Rohan stood in his way. She paced a small circle near the rug, her movements jerky and unnatural. Vikram has always been jealous of Rohan's position. He thinks he deserves the head of housekeeping title more than anyone. Tanya noted the specific wording, the way Meera focused on Vikram's ambition rather than the murder itself. "Did you see him enter?" Tanya asked. "I heard voices," Meera replied quickly, then stopped as if realizing she had said too much. Just in the hallway, he was shouting about the pantry logs. Martin turned his attention to the balcony doors again. The glass was fogged on the inside, but the latch showed no signs of tampering. If Vikram had entered, he would have had to do so before Rohan locked himself in, or through a method they had not yet discovered. The security footage shows Vikram in the pantry 10 minutes before the body was found, Martin said, testing the theory. But the camera angle misses the hallway leading here. The wind howled outside, rattling the heavy drapes and sending a draft through the room that made the candlelight flicker wildly. Tanya pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page where she had sketched the ferry maintenance logs from earlier in the day. Zafar Ali's boat was docked for repairs, she said, tracing a line of handwritten notes with her pen. But the log entry has a gap, 2 hours missing from the record. She looked up at Meera. If Zafar could get off the island, he could have come here without being seen on the main ferries. Meera shook her head violently, her hair escaping its pin. Zafar owes money to dangerous people. He would not risk coming here unless Rohan was blackmailing him. The name hung in the room, a heavy stone dropped into still water. Martin walked over to the desk, where a fragmented holographic projection flickered on the surface. It showed a blurred image of 2 figures arguing, but the audio track was corrupted beyond repair. "We have a video call," he said, tapping the glass surface. "But the encryption is quantum resistant. I cannot pull the clear feed without the key." He looked at Meera. "Did Rohan make any calls before he died?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He called his lover Priya Desai, the seamstress." Martin moved back toward the body, his eyes scanning the room for anything else that did not fit. He noticed a small sewing kit near the window, its contents spilled out onto the carpet. Inside lay a vial of concentrated chemical solvent, the label faded but still readable. "Priya Desai," he murmured, picking up the vial with a pair of tweezers. "She was here?" Meera's face went pale, her composure cracking for the first time. "No, she is in her quarters." She took a step forward, then stopped as if realizing she had moved too quickly. Rohan threatened to tell her husband about their affair. She must have been afraid. The logic was sound, but it felt like a story Meera had constructed to explain away the evidence. Martin set the vial down gently on the desk. "Fear makes people do strange things," he said. He walked back to the chaise, his mind racing through the possibilities. A locked room, a missing watch, a rival valet, a boatman with debts, and a seamstress with a motive. The pieces were there, but they did not form a picture that made sense. The poison required skin contact, yet the victim had been alone in a seal delivered. The humidity in the room seemed to rise suddenly, the air growing thick and heavy as the storm intensified outside. Martin turned to leave the suite, his hand on the door handle, when something caught his eye near the cuff of Rohan's jacket again. He leaned in closer, squinting against the dim light. A faint white residue clung to the fabric, barely visible against the dark velvet. It looked like dust, but it shimmered with a strange iridescence under the artificial light. "Wait," he said, freezing in place. The residue seemed to vanish as the humidity hit it, dissolving into nothingness before his eyes. He rubbed his finger over the spot again, feeling only the smooth texture of the velvet now. "What was that?" Tanya asked, stepping forward. Martin shook his head, his expression unreadable. Something that shouldn't be there. He looked at Meera, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and defiance. The white dust had been real, but it was gone now, leaving no trace except the memory of its existence. The room felt colder than before, the silence pressing in against their ears. Meera crossed her arms tighter, her knuckles turning white as she stared at Martin's empty hand. "You think I did this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I was in my own suite all night." She looked toward the balcony doors, then back to the body of her brother. He sold the watch. He betrayed the family name for a few rupees. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Martin did not answer immediately. He walked back to the door, his mind working through the impossible geometry of the crime. The residue was gone, but it had been there. The lock was engaged, but someone had entered. The watch was missing. But why take a key if you could just steal the money? He looked at Tanya, who was still studying the corrupted ferry logs on her screen. "We need to find that watch," he said finally. "It is the only thing that makes sense." Meera nodded slowly, her eyes dry and hard. "I will help you find it," she said. "But know this, if you do not find it, I will bury you both in court before you can solve a single crime." Martin opened the door, the sound of the storm rushing in to fill the silence. Tanya followed him out into the hallway, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and ozone. She tapped her phone again, but the screen remained black, the battery dead from the humidity. "My data is gone," she said, frustration edging into her voice. "Everything I found on the logs is lost." Martin stopped at the railing overlooking the lake, watching the waves crash against the palace walls. The water was dark and angry, hiding secrets beneath its surface that would never see the light of day. "We do not need data to know what happened," he said quietly. "We just need to find the gap in the logic." He turned back toward the room, his hand resting on the railing where the metal felt cold and slick. The white residue was a clue, but it was also a warning. Someone had used something that dissolved in humidity, something that left no trace unless you knew exactly what to look for. "Come on," he said to Tanya. "We have work to do." They walked away from the suite, leaving the body behind as the rain continued to hammer against the sapphire glass. Inside the room, Meera stood alone with her brother's body, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the white dust had vanished. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid, shaking it gently before setting it back down. The storm raged on outside, drowning out any sound that might have given away her presence in the room. She looked at the locked door one more time, then turned toward the balcony where the wind whistled through the cracks. "He should have trusted me," she whispered to the empty air. The words were lost in the roar of the rain, but the intent remained clear. She was not just a grieving sister, she was the architect of a plan that had gone wrong. The watch was missing, and without it, everything would fall apart. She walked over to the desk and picked up the fragmented holographic projection, her fingers trembling as she tried to stabilize the image. It flickered once, then died completely, leaving her in the dark. The air in the service pantry tasted of stale grease and wet stone, a sharp contrast to the sterile perfume of the upper floors. Martin pushed open the heavy steel door, his boots crunching on scattered grit as he moved deeper into the shadowed corridor. The hum of the hotel's ventilation system vibrated through the soles of his shoes, a constant reminder that this place breathed even when no one watched. He stopped before the dumbwaiter shaft, its iron doors sealed with fresh grease stains that had not yet fully dried. "Someone used this recently," he murmured, running a gloved finger along the rim of the mechanism. The metal was cold, but a faint warmth radiated from the gears inside, suggesting recent friction. He recalled the maintenance logs showing a scheduled blackout for the entire service lift system 2 days prior. That window of silence should have meant nothing moved in these walls, yet here they were, traces of activity defying the official record. Tanya sat at a cluttered table nearby, her tablet glowing against the dimness as she cross-referenced digital manifests with physical arrival times. The screen cast a pale blue light across her face, highlighting the furrow between her brows. "The ferry logs are clean on the surface," she said, tapping a line of code that seemed to loop endlessly without resolution. "Zafar's boat shows no departure during the murder window. It docked, stayed put, and returned." She scrolled down, searching for an anomaly in the data stream. A notification popped up, "Access denied." The system required a higher clearance level she did not possess. "The database is locked," she added, frustration tightening her voice. "They are hiding the gap behind a firewall that looks like standard encryption but feels custom-built." She leaned back, rubbing her temples as if trying to massage the logic into submission. If Zafar didn't leave on his boat, someone else had to bring Rohan's killer here without triggering the sensors. Martin crouched beside the dumbwaiter, pulling a small brush from his pocket to sweep the tracks for debris. The mechanism groaned as he shifted its weight, revealing a fine layer of white powder clinging to the guide rails. He collected a sample in an evidence bag, holding it up to the single bare bulb overhead. The dust glimmered with an iridescent sheen, identical to the residue found on Rohan's jacket. "This is fresh," he stated, his voice flat and factual. "The humidity down here should have dissolved it by now if it were old." He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees as he considered the implications. The powder suggested a delivery method that bypassed the sealed room entirely. Someone had used the service shaft to pass something directly into the victim's space without ever opening the main door. It was a clean kill, executed through the building's own infrastructure. Vikram Chaudhary entered the pantry then, his eyes darting nervously between the detectives and the dumbwaiter shaft. He wore a stained apron over his uniform, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. "You are looking at the wrong place, Sahib," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch as he gestured wildly with his hands. "The promotion went to me last week. I am the head of housekeeping now." He paced a small circle, repeating the word promotion like a mantra. "Why would I kill Rohan? He was nothing, just a boy who carried bags and wanted too much." His gaze flickered toward Martin's evidence bag, then quickly away. "If you want to know about secrets, ask Ananya Kapoor." The name hung in the damp air as he backed away toward the door. She threatened to cancel her film deal if Rohan did not give her special access. She said she would burn this place down with him inside. Tanya turned her attention back to the tablet, attempting a manual override on the ferry system. The screen flashed red again, rejecting her credentials. "They are scrubbing the logs," she muttered, typing furiously as if speed could outpace the encryption. "Someone is deleting entries in real time." She paused, looking up at Martin with a sharp glint in her eye. "Ananya's alibi is a private spa session," she said, her tone skeptical. "No digital footprint, no credit card swipes, just a handwritten log signed by a receptionist who never shows up on camera. It was the kind of perfect story that felt manufactured, a ghost alibi for a woman with a reputation for chaos. Tanya closed the tablet and set it down on the table with a heavy thud. If she didn't use her phone or her card, how did she communicate during those 2 hours? The question lingered, unanswered by the silence of the pantry. Martin walked to the far corner of the room, where a discarded jewelry case lay half-hidden behind a stack of crates. It was small, made of velvet, and smelled faintly of bitter almonds. He picked it up carefully, opening the latch with his tweezers. Inside sat an empty compartment, lined with silk that had been torn away in haste. "This belongs to Meera Singh," he said, holding the case out for Tanya to see. The scent was sharp and chemical, cutting through the smell of grease and dust. It matched the description of the vial Meera had held earlier. He traced the rim of the compartment with his finger, feeling a slight roughness where a hidden mechanism might have been. "She lost this down here," he observed, "or she dropped it while using the dumbwaiter." The discovery shifted the weight of suspicion back to the woman who claimed to be an architect of plans. Tanya stared at the case, her mind racing through the financial implications of such a small object. "If Meera was here," she said slowly, "she had access to the shaft before anyone else knew about it." She looked at Martin, her expression hardening as the pieces began to fit together in a dangerous pattern. "Rohan wasn't just stealing money," she continued, her voice dropping. "He was selling information. He found something in the watch that someone would kill for." The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. The white residue, the missing logs, the hidden compartment, it all pointed to a conspiracy that ran deeper than a simple theft. Martin pocketed the case, his face grim as he turned toward the exit. "We need to find out what was in that watch before they destroy it." The rain outside had intensified, hammering against the palace walls with a rhythm that sounded like applause or warning. They stepped out into the corridor, leaving the pantry behind but carrying its secrets with them. Tanya adjusted her scarf as she walked, her mind already formulating new questions for Meera Singh. "She said she was alone," Tanya murmured, echoing the earlier conversation. "But if she dropped that case here, she wasn't alone." Martin nodded once, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon as he scanned the shadows ahead. The hotel felt different now, a labyrinth of hidden passages and silent observers. Every door they passed seemed to hold a new threat, every shadow a potential witness. They moved forward into the darkness, knowing that the truth was buried somewhere in those, waiting to be dug up. The bitter almond scent lingered in the pantry, sharp and chemical against the damp silk of the wet towels stacked nearby. Martin ignored the smell for now, his attention fixed on the smoking jacket draped over the chaise lounge. He approached the garment with a gloved hand, lifting the collar to inspect the lining where the fabric met the skin. The velvet was heavy with monsoon moisture, clinging to itself in dark patches, yet the cuffs and lapels remained disturbingly clean. No residue coated the fibers, no iridescent sheen marred the deep blue wool, despite the humidity that should have activated any powder left there. He ran a finger along the inner seam, feeling for the slight grit of dried alkaloid, but found only the slick texture of damp silk. Something about the absence was louder than the presence of evidence would have been. The room felt sealed not by locks or water, but by a deliberate erasure that left no trace behind except the body on the floor. Tanya watched Meera Singh from across the living room, noting how the woman's fingers traced the rim of her teacup with obsessive precision. "I told you," Meera said, her voice precise and clipped. "The watch was not stolen. It is merely misplaced until I can locate the key to the vault." She did not look at Tanya, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from the porcelain cup. The woman spoke in short, declarative sentences, each word enunciated with surgical care, as if she were reading from a legal transcript rather than answering questions about a murder. "My brother was careless," Meera continued, finally lifting her eyes to meet Tanya's. "He sold things he should not have touched." This watch contained records of the estate trust that I need to recover. The story felt rehearsed, a narrative constructed to explain away the missing heirloom without admitting to any theft or foul play. Tanya noted the specific timing of Meera's pauses, the way she corrected her own grammar mid-sentence, as if ensuring no factual error slipped through. Martin crouched beside the chaise again, this time focusing on the pocket of the smoking jacket where a faint, sweet chemical odor lingered. The scent was subtle, almost imperceptible until one leaned in close, and it vanished instantly when he shifted his weight and disturbed the air currents in the room. He pulled a small handheld spectrometer from his kit, aiming the lens at the fabric near the pocket lining. The device hummed softly, its screen displaying a cascade of data that refused to stabilize into a clear match for known alkaloids. "It is reading as organic compounds," Martin muttered, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. "But the signature is fragmented, like someone wiped it clean and then tried to mask the spot." He stood up, brushing invisible dust from his knees, and walked toward the balcony doors to check the seals again. The rubber gaskets were compressed perfectly against the frame, tight enough to stop a breath of air, let alone a person or a delivery system. The geometry of the crime still did not make sense. Meera set her teacup down on the saucer with a sharp clink that echoed in the quiet room. "You are wasting your time," she said, her tone hardening. Vikram Chaudhary was seen entering the service pantry 10 minutes before Rohan died. She paused, watching Martin's reaction closely, as if measuring the impact of her words. He wanted the promotion to head housekeeping. He knew Rohan was in the way. The accusation flew out fast and furious, a desperate attempt to redirect the investigation toward a rival who had recently been passed over for advancement. But Tonya saw the micro-expression flicker across Meera's face, a brief tightening of the jaw that suggested she was lying about something far more significant than staff jealousy. "And what of Ananya Kapoor?" Tonya asked, leaning forward slightly. She threatened to cancel her production deal if Rohan did not grant special access. Meera's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before she smoothed her features back into a mask of calm indifference. Martin moved to the dumbwaiter shaft in the pantry, his flashlight cutting through the gloom where the metal rails gleamed with a faint white residue. He had already seen this powder on Rohan's jacket and knew it dissolved instantly upon contact with humidity, leaving no trace for standard forensic sweeps. But here, in the dry, enclosed space of the service shaft, the substance remained stubbornly visible, a ghost of the delivery method used to kill the valet. He took a sample with tweezers, placing it into a sealed evidence bag without breaking his focus. The powder was delivered through this shaft, he said, turning back to Tonya, who had joined him in the pantry. But how did the killer get close enough to apply it without being seen on camera? The question hung in the damp air, unanswered and heavy with implication. Martin's mind raced through the timeline of events, trying to reconcile the sealed room with the physical evidence that pointed to a delivery system that should not have existed. Tanya turned to leave the suite, her boots clicking softly against the marble floor as she moved toward the service pantry exit. Her eyes caught something on the rim of the dumbwaiter tray just before it disappeared into the ceiling shaft above. A tiny dried smear of white powder clung to the metal edge, a substance that should not exist in a luxury hotel kitchen where everything was scrubbed clean daily. She crouched down, her heart skipping a beat as she realized the significance of the find. This was not just residue, it was a deliberate placement, a trail left by someone who knew exactly how the poison worked and how to hide it from detection. "Martin," she called out, her voice steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline. "Look at this." He joined her instantly, his eyes widening as he saw the smear. The evidence was small, almost insignificant on its own. But in the context of a sealed room and a missing watch, it changed everything they thought they knew about the impossible crime. Meera watched them from the doorway, her face unreadable as she processed their reaction to the new discovery. "It is just dust," she said quickly, stepping forward to block their view of the tray. "The hotel is old. Dust accumulates in every corner." Her hand moved instinctively toward the jewelry case on the table, a possessive gesture that betrayed her true intent. She did not want them looking too closely at anything related to her brother's death, especially not the items he had left behind. "I need you to leave now," she commanded, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You are disturbing my grief and wasting time that could be spent finding the real killer." But Martin ignored her plea, his gaze fixed on the smear of white powder that held the key to. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the sapphire glass windows with a rhythmic violence that matched the tension inside the room. Tonya stood up slowly, pocketing her evidence bag while keeping her eyes locked on Meera's face. "We will be back," she said, her tone final and leaving no room for argument. "And next time we will not be asking questions." She turned to Martin, nodding once as they walked out of the suite together, leaving Meera alone with her secrets and the body of her brother. The smell of bitter almonds seemed to follow them down the hallway, a reminder that the truth was still hidden somewhere in the damp silk and stilled gears of this palace of lies. Martin paused at the end of the corridor, looking back at the door they had just closed. "She is hiding something," he said, his voice low. "The watch is not missing because it was stolen." He tapped the evidence bag in his pocket where the white powder sat waiting for analysis. "It is hidden because someone knows what is inside it." Tonya nodded, her mind already racing through the financial records and digital footprints she needed to cross-reference with this new physical clue. The game had moved, and they were no longer just chasing a ghost. They were hunting a person who knew exactly. The damp air of the service corridor clung to Martin's leather jacket as he navigated toward the ferry control station, his boots clicking on the wet concrete floor. He carried a tablet loaded with fragmented logs that made no sense on the surface, but told a different story when viewed through the lens of maintenance schedules. The monsoon rain hammered against the corrugated roof overhead, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to drown out everything else. Inside the control room, the hum of servers competed with the storm outside, creating a static-filled atmosphere that made concentration difficult. Martin pulled up the security feed from the private pier, his eyes scanning the timestamps for any deviation from the standard protocol. The gap in the ferry logs was not an error. It was a deliberate deletion, timed to coincide exactly with the maintenance window for the service lift. He traced the digital footprint of the deletion back to a terminal that should have been offline, a ghost signal leaving no trace but the missing data itself. Tonya stood in the lobby where she had gathered the remaining suspects, her presence commanding yet approachable as she watched their reactions to the summons. Vikram Chaudhary paced near the potted palms, his movements jerky and nervous, while Ananya Kapoor sat with her legs crossed, checking her reflection in a polished silver tray. Priya Desai stood by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching the rain blur the view of the lake. Zafar Ali leaned against a pillar, his arms folded loosely, though his eyes darted toward every door that opened and closed. "We are not here to discuss alibis yet," Tonya began, her voice cutting through their murmurs with practiced ease. "We need to understand how someone moved between the palace and the private pier without triggering a single sensor." The room fell silent as she placed a printed sheet on the low table between them. The ferry logs show a gap of 2 hours during the monsoon peak, yet the cameras were supposedly active the entire time. Vikram stepped forward immediately, his hands waving frantically, as if trying to ward off an accusation that had not even been spoken aloud. "I was checking the maintenance schedule," he blurted out, his voice rising in pitch until it cracked slightly on the last word. "The system glitches when we run the diagnostic, especially with this rain. It deletes the logs temporarily until a human resets the terminal." He glanced at Ananya, then quickly looked away, his eyes darting to the floor tiles, as if searching for an escape route. I know it looks bad, Sahib, but I was just doing my job. The promotion meant everything to me, and I would not risk losing it over a computer error. His rapid-fire explanation trailed off into a mutter about bad omens and stars that were misaligned against his interests. Tanya watched the micro-expressions flicker across his face, noting how he repeated the word Job 3 times, as if trying to convince himself of its truth. Ananya leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she dissected the situation with the precision of a director blocking a scene. "Cut," she said sharply, holding up a hand to silence Vikram's rambling defense. "The angle is wrong here." She turned her gaze to Tanya, her expression shifting from defensive to accusatory in an instant. "Rohan was blackmailing me too, you know. He threatened to expose my access codes if I did not give him exclusive rights to the palace grounds for my film." Her voice dropped, becoming cold and analytical as she listed her grievances with a detached precision that felt rehearsed. "I saw Meera near the docks earlier that day carrying a heavy case. She was acting strange, like a woman who had already made her decision." The mention of Meera's name caused a ripple of tension to move through the group, though no one spoke immediately. Priya finally spoke, her voice soft and lyrical as she wove her own thread into the tangled narrative of that day. "I saw Rohan too," she murmured, her fingers tracing the pattern on her sleeve as if it were a map of the events she described. "He was meeting someone near the old boathouse. He looked afraid, like a man who had realized he had pulled one thread too loose." She paused, searching for the right words to describe the weight of his fear without using abstract terms. "The watch case he carried was heavy, filled with papers that could ruin us all if they got out." Her gaze drifted to Zafar, who stiffened slightly at her indirect reference to his own secrets. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the truth about Rohan's leverage over each of them began to surface. Martin returned from the control station just as the group confrontation reached its peak, holding a printout that looked innocuous but contained the key to the entire mystery. He handed the paper to Tanya without a word, his expression unreadable behind the fatigue etched into his features. "The gap corresponds exactly to the window where Meera could have accessed the private pier," Martin stated, his voice clipped and precise as he pointed to a specific timestamp on the page. "And the maintenance schedule was altered manually from a terminal that requires physical access." He did not look at the suspects as he spoke, his focus entirely on the evidence in Tanya's hands. The silence stretched between them again, heavy with the realization that the killer had used the island's infrastructure against them all. Before anyone could respond to Martin's revelation, his tablet buzzed with an urgent alert from the lab, breaking the tension with a sharp, digital chime. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he read the preliminary report on the white powder found on the Dumbwaiter tray. "This changes everything," he muttered, turning the device so Tanya could see the analysis results. The substance was not a standard cleaning agent or household chemical. It matched a rare alkaloid used in experimental nerve agents, a compound that should not exist outside of high-security research facilities. The implications hit them all at once, shifting the investigation from a simple theft to something far more dangerous and calculated. Martin looked up from the screen, his blue eyes locking onto Tanya with a new intensity as the scope of the crime expanded before their eyes. Tanya pocketed her tablet, her mind already racing through the financial connections that could explain how such a substance ended up in Udaipur. The suspects watched her closely, their faces pale and strained, as they realized the gravity of the situation had just escalated beyond their personal grievances. "We need to talk about who has access to restricted chemical supplies," Tanya said, her voice steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She looked at each person in turn, searching for the one who might have made a mistake in their own story. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, drowning out the sound of their breathing as the investigation moved into uncharted territory. Meera stood by the service pantry door, her spine rigid against the humming hum of the refrigerator unit. The air inside tasted of stale grease and wet wool, a sharp contrast to the sterile scent of the lab report Martin held in his hand. She did not offer them a seat or ask for water. She simply waited with the patience of a predator who knew the trap had already sprung. "The timeline is irrelevant," she stated, her voice precise and devoid of any tremor. "I entered the suite at 09:15 to retrieve the watch." Martin stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. He did not blink as he looked up the narrow shaft that led to the dumbwaiter. "The logs show a gap in the sensor array between 08 Crane and 10 o'clock," he replied, keeping his tone flat. "You claim you were looking for an object while the system was blind." Meera smoothed the front of her silk blouse, a gesture that looked more like a defensive maneuver than grooming. "I was not alone in my movements, Detective. The storm obscured the cameras. I merely walked through the blind spot to find what belonged to me." Tanya moved past Martin into the small pantry, her eyes scanning the rows of stacked linens and cleaning supplies. She pulled a swab kit from her pocket, the plastic crinkling loudly in the narrow space. "We need to check the jacket again," she said, addressing Meera without turning around. The fabric of Rohan's smoking jacket lay spread on a metal utility cart, damp with condensation but strangely clean of the fine white dust that had coated the dumbwaiter rails. Tanya pressed the swab against the collar, then the cuffs, rubbing gently before holding it up to the light. "Look at this," she murmured, her brow furrowing as the readout on her handheld device flickered with an error code. "The residue should be everywhere if he was exposed in here." She tapped the screen hard, trying to force a calibration, but the display remained stubbornly blank. "The humidity is high," Meera interjected, stepping into Tanya's peripheral vision. "Perhaps the powder dissolved." Tanya turned slowly, her warm brown eyes locking onto Meera's face. "It dissolves on contact with skin or dry heat. This jacket was damp from the storm outside, yet it holds no trace of the alkaloid we found in the shaft." Martin walked to the dumbwaiter control panel, his fingers tracing the grease marks that stained the metal track. The grime was fresh, dark and oily, inconsistent with the dusty accumulation he had seen during his previous inspection of the maintenance logs. "This grease is new," he said, turning back to face the room. "Someone lubed this shaft recently." Meera's posture stiffened, her chin lifting a fraction higher as she prepared a rebuttal. "Maintenance schedules are strict, Detective. Vikram Chaudhary handles these tasks on Tuesdays." Martin shook his head, a small, sharp movement that cut through the room. "Vikram admitted to checking the schedule yesterday, but he also said the system glitched during the monsoon peak. This grease suggests manual intervention when no one was supposed to be near the shaft." He pulled a cloth from his pocket and wiped a sample of the oil, holding it up for Tanya to see. "It smells of solvent," Martin added, his voice dropping an octave. "Not standard machine oil." Meera took a step back, her hand moving instinctively toward the small jewelry case she had placed on the counter. The box was locked tight, the brass clasp glued. "You will not open that," Tanya said, her voice firm as she stepped between Meera and the case. "We need to see what is inside." Meera's hand froze midair, hovering over the lock mechanism with a tension that made her knuckles turn white. "It contains family heirlooms," she declared, her words clipped and final, "private property protected by inheritance law." The statement hung in the air, sharp and defensive, like a shield raised too quickly. "Heirlooms do not require a biometric lock to keep them safe from dust," Martin countered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Meera's face. "And they certainly do not explain why you were arguing with Rohan about this specific case 3 days ago." Meera's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something raw and desperate flashing behind her eyes before she masked it again. "Rohan sold things he had no right to touch," she snapped, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "He tried to sell the trust records hidden inside. I was retrieving what was stolen." Tanya reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, pressing the button to capture Meera's admission. "So you admit he was hiding records?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral but probing. "I admit nothing of the sort," Meera corrected instantly, her enunciation precise as if reading from a legal transcript. "I stated that Rohan attempted to liquidate assets that were not his to sell." She paused, searching for a way to redirect the conversation without lying outright. "The watch contained the ledger for the estate trust. Without it, I cannot secure the family name against the creditors." Martin leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest as he processed the new information. "And the nerve agent?" he asked quietly. "Did Rohan sell that too, or was that your invention to protect the ledger?" Meera said nothing, her gaze drifting to the window where the rain lashed against the glass. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken accusations and the smell of ozone from the storm outside. Tanya noticed a faint, sweet odor rising from the gloves Meera had discarded on the counter moments before. It was a subtle scent, like bitter almonds mixed with something floral, that vanished the instant Meera clutched her hands together again. "Those gloves," Tanya said, pointing to the discarded fabric. "You were wearing them when you entered the suite?" Meera looked down at her bare hands, then back up at Tanya with a cold, calculating stare. "I wear them for protection against dust and chemicals during my work with gemstones." The explanation felt rehearsed, a story constructed to fit the evidence rather than reveal it. "Gemstone work does not require Veratrine," Martin said, his voice cutting through Meera's defense. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. "You knew what Rohan had in that watch before we even found the body." Meera turned her back on them, staring at the locked case with the intensity that suggested she was willing to burn the world down rather than open it. The smell of almond oil lingered in Tanya's nose as she watched Meera stand motionless by the counter. It was not the scent of cleaning supplies or standard perfume. It was the distinct, cloying aroma of cyanide compounds often used in industrial processes. "We are seizing this case," Tanya announced, reaching for the brass lock with a pair of pliers from her kit. Meera did not move to stop her, but her eyes widened slightly as if she expected violence. Martin pulled out his handcuffs, the metal clicking softly in the quiet room. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited, his voice devoid of emotion. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Meera finally spoke, her voice low and steady despite the situation. "I did not kill him," she said, the words dropping like stones into a deep well. "I only wanted my property back." The room fell silent again, save for the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windowpane. Tanya pried the lock open with a sharp twist of her wrist, the brass clasp giving way with a metallic snap that echoed off the tiled walls. Inside lay not gold or jewels, but a small velvet-lined compartment containing a hollowed-out pocket watch case. The casing was empty, but the interior lining bore a faint chemical stain that matched the residue on the dumbwaiter rails. Martin picked up the case with a gloved hand, holding it up to the light. "The powder was applied here," he said, his voice flat as he examined the stain. "Not on Rohan." Meera watched him, her face unreadable, a mask of cold indifference that hid whatever turmoil raged beneath. "He took it from me," she whispered, the first time her voice had lost its precision. "I just wanted it back." Tanya looked at Martin, then at the empty case in his hand, realizing the tragedy was far more complex than a simple theft. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet breathing of three people trapped in a room full of secrets. The brass clasp of the jewelry case clicked shut, sealing the empty watch casing inside. Tanya wiped her hands on a handkerchief, leaving a smear of chemical residue against the white cotton. Meera stood frozen by the counter, her eyes fixed on the locked box as if it contained a live grenade rather than stolen history. "The ledger is gone," she stated, the words flat and devoid of tremor despite the circumstances, "but I did not kill him." Tanya stepped away from the case, moving toward the door where Martin waited in the hallway shadows. They had extracted every drop of confession Meera would give without a lawyer present. Now they needed to know how the killer moved through a sealed palace while cameras watched every step. The humidity in the room felt oppressive, sticking their shirts like a second skin. Martin pushed open the heavy door leading to the server farm, the air instantly dropping 10 degrees as the hum of cooling fans hit them. Rows of black racks stretched into the gloom, blinking with status lights that looked like distant stars trapped in glass. He ignored Tanya for a moment, his fingers dancing over a keyboard connected to a local terminal. The screen flickered, displaying lines of code that scrolled too fast for the untrained eye. "The ferry logs are clean on the surface," he murmured, tracing a sequence of timestamps with his index finger. "But there is a gap in the maintenance schedule." He pulled up a secondary window showing the automated system's internal clock. A manual override command had been executed at 2:14 a.m., exactly when Rohan died. The code required a biometric key that belonged only to Sthur. Tanya leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching as she watched the data stream. "It originated from the executive wing," she said, pointing to an IP address that resolved to a specific terminal in the Sapphire suite. The killer was already inside the room before Rohan even arrived. Martin nodded slowly, the realization settling like dust on his boots. If the override came from within the suite, the entire Ferry Gap was a distraction designed to make them look outward. He tapped a key, forcing the system to render the raw sensor data for that hour. The screen filled with thermal signatures, most of which were static heat blobs from furniture and walls. One figure moved through the frame, carrying something small and heavy in their hand. The control room was silent, save for the whirring fans and the rhythmic tapping of Martin's keyboard. Tanya pulled up the physical security footage on a second monitor, slowing the playback to 1 frame per second. The grainy black and white image showed the service corridor leading to the Dumbwaiter shaft. A figure emerged from the shadows, their gait uneven, dragging the left leg slightly with each step. "Look at the hip," Tanya said, leaning closer until her nose almost touched the screen. "That is not a limp from an old injury." She paused, searching for the right word to describe the movement. "It is a compensation for weight." The figure carried a satchel that pulled their shoulder down, creating a specific asymmetry in their stride. Martin cross-referenced this with the guest manifest and staff roster. The image on Tanya's screen sharpened as she enhanced the contrast, revealing a face partially obscured by a hood. It was not Vikram Chaudhary, whose alibi held up under scrutiny, nor Zafar Ali, who had been spotted at the docks. The gait matched someone who had recently undergone surgery or carried a chronic load in one hand for years. Tanya scrolled through the database of recent injuries and found a match that made her stomach turn. Priya Desai, the seamstress, had reported a shoulder strain 3 weeks ago after lifting heavy bolts of silk for Ananya Kapoor's production, but the financial records told a different story. She accessed a private ledger linked to Rohan's personal accounts, finding a series of microtransactions that stopped abruptly 2 days before his death. Ananya Kapoor appeared in her mind as she pieced together the threads. The location scout had threatened to cancel her deal if Rohan did not grant exclusive access to the palace grounds, if Priya was blackmailing Rohan about an affair, and Ananya needed silence to protect her production. They might have formed a temporary alliance. Tanya highlighted the transaction dates on the screen. Rohan was selling secrets, she said, turning to Martin with a look of grim satisfaction. He took money from everyone. The evidence pointed toward a conspiracy where multiple suspects had motive, but only one could execute the delivery through the Dumbwaiter shaft without triggering the sensors. The manual override code remained the smoking gun, linking the crime directly to the Sapphire suite. Martin stood up from the chair, his joints popping in the quiet room. He walked over to the window that overlooked the lake, where the rain had finally begun to slacken into a steady drizzle. The killer knew the system would flag a manual override, he said, watching the water lap against the palace walls. so they made it look like a routine maintenance check. He turned back to Tonya, his eyes sharp with the final piece of the puzzle. The terminal in the Sapphire suite had been accessed by someone who knew the exact sequence of codes and the precise time window needed to bypass the security protocols. It was not a crime of passion or jealousy. This was a calculated move designed to hide a ledger inside a watch that no one would ever check again. Tonya saved the footage and closed the files, her fingers trembling slightly as she powered down the terminal. The connection between the suspects was clear now, but the identity of the person who actually pulled the trigger remained hidden in the shadows. "We need to talk to Priya," she said, grabbing her coat from the back of the chair. "And Ananya." Martin nodded, opening the door for her as they stepped out into the hallway. The air smelled of ozone and wet stone, a reminder that the storm was far from over. They had the map, but the territory was still dangerous. As they walked toward the elevator, Martin checked his watch, noting the time. It was almost dawn, and the real work was just beginning. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, sealing them in a small box of metal and glass. Tonya looked at Martin, her face pale in the dim light. "If Priya did this," she said, her voice low and steady, "she did it to protect herself." Martin pressed the button for the ground floor, his expression unreadable. "Or to protect someone else," he replied, watching the numbers on the display count down. The mystery of the Veratrine dust was solved in theory, but the human element remained a chaotic variable. They stepped out into the lobby where the night shift guard was just finishing his log entry. Martin flashed his badge, ignoring the man's confused look. "We are done here," he said, walking toward the exit without looking back. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the city lights like shattered glass. Rain lashed the service pantry windows, turning the Udaipur night into a blur of gray and amber. Martin stood before the Dumbwaiter shaft, the cold metal biting through his leather gloves as he ran a handheld UV spectrometer along the guide rails. The device hummed, a low vibration that traveled up his arm and settled in his teeth. He did not blink as the green laser scanned the microscopic tracks where fresh grease had been applied hours ago. "Readings are inconsistent," Martin murmured, watching the digital display flicker between organic compounds and error codes. The screen refused to settle on a single value, jumping from starch to protein before locking onto an alkaloid signature that matched the white powder found on Rohan's jacket. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a smear of grime across his skin. If this was a simple theft, someone would have scrubbed these rails clean. The residue remained because it was applied after the initial cleaning cycle, a deliberate layer over the old grease. Tonya sat at the narrow metal table in the corner, the blue light of Vikram Chaudhry's tablet casting sharp shadows across her face. She scrolled through the Monsoon Maintenance Fund ledger, her eyes darting between the digital entries and the physical receipts scattered around her. The numbers did not add up, a pattern of microtransactions that bypassed the standard audit trail Rohan had been investigating. "Vikram," she said, sliding the tablet toward him as he paced near the door. "You claim you only access the maintenance schedule to check for glitches." Vikram stopped pacing, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a cup of cold tea that never arrived. "I told you, Sahib, the system deletes logs when the power surges," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "But these transactions," Tonya pressed, tapping a line item dated 2 days before the murder. "They were authorized from your terminal, not the main server. Why would a junior valet need access to high-level trust funds?" Vikram opened his mouth, then closed it, his eyes darting toward the dark shaft of the Dumbwaiter. The air in the corridor smelled of wet linen and stale oil, a thick scent that coated the back of the throat. Martin leaned closer to the spectrometer as the device beeped again, this time with a sharp, urgent tone that cut through the ambient hum of the building's ventilation. He adjusted the lens, focusing on a specific groove in the metal rail where the residue had pooled. "It is not just powder," he said, his voice flat and devoid of tremor despite the sudden realization. "The molecular structure shows it was mixed with a binding agent to ensure skin absorption." He looked up at Tonya, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he processed the implication. The poison needed direct contact, which meant the killer had touched these rails while applying the substance, but the maintenance logs showed no one entered this area for 3 days prior to the murder. Someone had bypassed the automated system and manually greased the tracks with a contaminated cloth. Vikram wiped his palms on his trousers, leaving dark streaks of grease that matched the fresh smear on the dumbwaiter shaft. "I did not touch the rails," he insisted, taking a step back as if to distance himself from the accusation. "My hands were full with the laundry cart, like always." Tonya stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that made Vikram flinch. She walked around the table, closing the distance between them until she could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. "The ledger shows you moved 5,000 rupees into an offshore account yesterday," she said, keeping her tone conversational but firm. "And now you are standing here with grease on your hands that matches the residue on the shaft." Vikram laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the middle. "Everyone has access to those funds during maintenance season, madam. You cannot pin this on me because I was nervous about my promotion." He turned away, his shoulders hunching as if he carried a heavy, invisible weight. Martin ignored the argument, his attention fixed on the spectrometer's readout, which finally stabilized on a chemical profile. The screen displayed Veratrine alkaloid with a confidence level of 98%, confirming what they had suspected but could not prove until now. He pocketed the device and moved to the stack of clean linens waiting for distribution, his boots scuffing against the wet floor. Something was wrong with the inventory count. The laundry logs listed 40 towels for the Sapphire suite delivery, yet only 38 were present in the bin. Martin pulled a single white towel from the top of the pile and held it up to the fluorescent light. It felt damp, heavier than the others, and smelled faintly of bitter almonds. He brought the fabric closer to his face, inhaling deeply as the scent confirmed the presence of the same alkaloid found on the rails. Tonya turned from Vikram, her gaze snapping toward Martin as he held up the towel. "That towel was never logged in the inventory," she said, her voice sharp with realization. "If it came out of this bin, someone added it after the crime scene was sealed?" Martin nodded once, a small, precise movement that acknowledged the gravity of the new evidence. The killer had not just used the dumbwaiter to deliver the poison, they had returned later to clean up the tracks, leaving behind a contaminated towel in their haste. Vikram watched them with wide, fearful eyes, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the physical proof. "I did it," he whispered, then stopped as if realizing the words would condemn him instantly. "No," he corrected quickly, shaking his head. "I saw someone else do it." He pointed a trembling finger toward the dark corridor that led to the staff quarters. "A woman with a limp." The revelation hung in the damp air, shifting the investigation from financial fraud to physical violence. Martin stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his flashlight as he prepared to move deeper into the service wing. Tonya grabbed her tablet and followed him, leaving Vikram alone in the pantry with his trembling hands and broken alibi. The corridor stretched ahead, a narrow tunnel of shadows and steam where the palace's secrets were hidden from the guests above. Martin paused at the threshold, listening for any sound that might betray their presence before pushing through the heavy door. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the roof tiles with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of his own heart. They were close to the truth now, but the path forward was obscured by lies and the thick fog of the monsoon. The damp towel sat on the metal table, its white fibers stiff with dried poison. Vikram's claim about the limping woman echoed in Martin's mind, a story too neat to be true. He pushed the evidence bag aside and pulled out the empty gold watch casing from his pocket. The metal felt cold against his palm, heavier than brass should be. This was not just stolen jewelry, it was a lock waiting for a key. He fitted a magnifying loupe over his right eye and leaned close to the gears inside the open case. The mechanism was pristine, devoid of forced entry marks or tool scratches that usually accompanied a break-in. Instead, the tiny brass teeth were shifted with surgical precision into a pattern that made no sense for telling time. It looked less like a clockwork and more like a cipher wheel set to a specific code. Martin traced the alignment with a gloved finger, feeling the microscopic resistance of metal on metal. Someone had not tried to crack this watch, they had tuned it. Tonya sat across from Zafar Ali in the cramped server room, the air thick with the ozone smell of overheating processors. Her tablet screen glowed blue, casting sharp shadows across his weathered face as she tapped a line in his maintenance log. "The digital timestamp says you docked at 4 a.m., she said, her voice steady and devoid of accusation. Zafar shifted in the plastic chair, his hands gripping the edge until his knuckles turned white. He looked away toward the blinking server racks rather than meeting her gaze. "I told you, madam. The rain washed out the signal for an hour. I wrote it down by hand before the system came back online." Tonya leaned forward, sliding a printed receipt across the table toward him. The paper crinkled loudly in the silence of the room. "This manual entry was signed at 4:05 a.m., she replied, her eyes locking onto his. "But your boat's GPS beacon pinged the shore station 3 minutes later. You were moving while you claimed to be tied up." Zafar opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, realizing the trap had already snapped shut. The server logs refused to yield their secrets without a fight. Cavalier typed furiously on a mechanical keyboard, the clatter echoing off the concrete walls like rain on a tin roof. "The file is corrupted," he muttered, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage the logic into submission. "It looks like a remote wiper program triggered the moment Rohan's heart stopped. Someone didn't want us seeing what was in his cloud storage." Martin watched the screen where data streams dissolved into static before their eyes. He had seen this before in Prague, a digital scorched earth policy used to hide financial crimes. "It's too clean," Martin said, standing up and pacing the narrow aisle between the server racks. "A real wiper leaves garbage data behind. This is a perfect erasure." Tonya looked up from her tablet, her expression grim. Unless it wasn't a digital attack at all, she pointed to the physical ledger she had pulled from Rohan's safe deposit box earlier that day. The numbers in the book matched nothing on the screen, suggesting the real records were never uploaded to begin with. Martin returned his attention to the watch, turning it over in his hands under the harsh fluorescent light. The gears clicked softly as he rotated the crown, testing the tension of the mainspring. He realized then that the alignment was not random. It matched the cipher pattern used by the old Singh family banking ledgers. This watch did not hold a chip or a microdrive. It held the key itself, mechanical and analog in a world gone digital. He pressed his thumb against a specific gear tooth and felt a faint click deep inside the casing. The backplate released with a spring-loaded snap, falling onto the metal table with a dull thud. Inside the hollow space lay no jewels, no diamonds, but a single strip of burnt-out microfilm. It curled at the edges, blackened, as if it had been exposed to intense heat. Martin held the film up to the light, squinting against the glare. The images were faint, ghostly outlines of faces that did not belong to any guest currently registered at the palace. Zafar slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking through the server room like a gunshot. "I am telling you the truth," he shouted, his voice rising an octave in panic. "The ferry was delayed by the storm. The logs are wrong because the machine is broken." Tonya did not flinch at his outburst. She simply sat back and watched him unravel, her expression calm and analytical. "The machine works fine, Zafar," she said softly, tapping the screen again. "It's your story that doesn't add up. You were on the water when you claimed to be docked." The boatman slumped forward, his shoulders shaking with a sudden, defeated exhaustion. He knew he was caught, yet he refused to explain why he lied about the time. "Someone paid me," he whispered finally, staring at his boots. "They said if I didn't move the boat, they would burn my house down." The confession hung heavy in the humid air, a partial truth that solved nothing and raised more questions. Martin slid the microfilm across the table to Tanya, who examined it with a jeweler's loupe of her own. "This isn't just blackmail material," she said, tracing the faint image of a woman in a sari. "It looks like a ledger of transactions from before Rohan even started working here." The film was brittle, fragile as dried leaves, and smelled of burnt plastic. They had been chasing ghosts in the digital realm while the real evidence sat inside a mechanical watch. The wiper program on the server made sense now. It was a distraction to draw them away from physical clues. Martin felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he realized how close they had come to missing the killer entirely. "Zafar was just the mule," Martin said, looking at the film strip. "He moved the boat because someone told him to." "But who gave the order?" Tanya looked up from the film, her eyes sharp and searching. "The woman in the picture is not Priya Desai." She paused, turning the strip of film over in her fingers. "And she is definitely not Meera Singh." The humid air of the server room seemed to press against Martin's skin as he stared at the burnt film. He needed to know who that woman was before they made their next move. "Run a facial recognition scan," he ordered, pointing to the screen. "Focus on the guests from 3 years ago." Kavi Iyer hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "That data is archived and requires a high-level clearance code." Tonya stood up, walking over to Kavi's station with a calm authority that brooked no argument. She typed in a command she had memorized from Rohan's personal files, bypassing the security layer with surgical precision. The screen flickered, then displayed a match with 98% certainty. "Ananya Kapoor," Tonya said, her voice stripped of inflection as the realization hit them both. The Bollywood scout had been in Udaipur 3 years ago for a location shoot that was never publicized. She had access to the palace then, just as she did now. Martin looked at the watch, then back at the screen. The pieces were finally clicking into place, but the picture they formed was far more dangerous than anyone expected. Martin pocketed the microfilm strip and turned his attention back to Zafar, who sat slumped in his chair with a hollow look in his eyes. "You said someone told you to move the boat?" Martin asked, keeping his voice low and steady. "Did they say why?" Zafar shook his head slowly, his hair falling into his eyes. "They just said wait until the storm broke." The answer was useless, a dead end that led nowhere but deeper into the dark. Tonya stood up and gathered her tablet, signaling that their time with the boatman was over. She had extracted everything she could from him without breaking his spirit completely. "We'll be back," she said to Zafar, her tone leaving no room for negotiation, "and next time we want names." They walked out of the server room and into the cool night air, the weight of the new discovery pressing down on them. The killer was not just a guest or a staff member, it was someone who had been watching from the shadows for years. Kavi's voice still echoed in the server room, a digital ghost of wiped logs and fragmented faces. The hum of the cooling fans felt louder now, pressing against Martin's temples as he stared at the cold steel table where Rohan's watch lay disassembled. He did not look up when Tonya entered, his magnifying loupe already pressed to his eye. "The casing is a lie," he said, precise in its delivery despite the fatigue weighing on him. The gold shell was pristine, untouched by the grime of the shaft or the humidity of the lake. Yet the internal mechanism told a different story of violence and desperation. Martin adjusted the focus, revealing gears that had been forced out of alignment, not worn by time but crushed by a sudden, desperate pressure. "Someone did not try to decrypt data with this," he murmured, lifting a tiny spring with tweezers. "They tried to hide a theft." The spring trembled in his grip before he set it down on the velvet mat. Tonya moved to the edge of the table, her eyes scanning the scattered components. She had spent the last hour wrestling with Zafar Ali's financial records, finding them as slippery as oil on wet stone. "Zafar claims he never touched the watch," she said, leaning against a server rack that radiated a low electric warmth. "But his boat logs show a gap of 40 minutes during the monsoon peak. Just enough time to run an errand." Martin ignored her, focusing instead on the microscopic residue clinging to the watch's mainspring. He pulled a swab from his kit and dabbed at the metal, the chemical smell sharp and alien in the sterile room. "This is not from the shaft," he said, holding the sample up to the light. "It matches the alkaloid trace we found on the Dumbwaiter rails, but it is older, degraded." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Rohan had been handling poison before he ever entered the service pantry. The air in Rohan's study felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of old paper and dried flowers that had long since lost their fragrance. Zafar Ali sat in the high-backed chair, his hands resting on his knees, fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against his thigh. He did not look at Tonya when she entered, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath his feet. "You think I took it?" he said, delivery measured and deliberate, and devoid of the usual maritime metaphors that colored his speech. "That I stole a watch to pay a debt." Tonya walked around the desk, setting a tablet down with a sharp click that made Zafar flinch. "I think you moved money where it could not be traced," she replied, tone warm but unyielding, "and I think Rohan found out before he died." She tapped the screen, projecting a graph of unauthorized transfers onto the wall. The lines were jagged, erratic, like a heartbeat in distress. Zafar stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. He did not deny it, nor did he admit to anything. Instead, he moved to the window and looked out at the dark water of the lake, where the palace lights reflected in broken shards. "Rohan was digging," he said, back to Tonya. "He wanted to expose the corruption in the trust. He thought I was part of it." His voice rose slightly, a crack appearing in his composure. "But I am just a man who pilots a boat through bad weather. I do not decide where the storm comes from." Tonya stepped closer, brows furrowing as she watched him struggle with the weight of his own secrets. "So you moved the money," she said, pressing the advantage. "And when he threatened to speak, you made sure he stayed silent." Zafar turned then, face a mask of weary resignation. "I did not kill him," he whispered, "but I knew he was dead before the body was found." Martin returned from the study with the watch mechanism in his hand, expression grim. The spectral analysis confirmed his suspicion. The residue on the spring was Veratrine, mixed with a binding agent that had been applied days ago. "Rohan was poisoned long before he entered the room," Martin said, placing the components back into their case. The powder on the jacket was a distraction, a red herring planted to confuse the timeline. Tonya nodded, mind racing through the implications. If Rohan had been poisoned earlier, then the sealed room and the camera logs were irrelevant. The killer had not needed to bypass security. They had simply waited for the poison to take hold. "Ananya Kapoor," she said, name dropping into the silence like a stone. She had access to the chemicals. She had the motive. Martin looked at her, pale blue eyes sharp with understanding. "And the watch," he added. "It was not stolen for its value. It was stolen because it contained the ledger Rohan was using to blackmail everyone." The tension in the room snapped when Martin reached for a vial of solvent on the table, intending to clean the residue from his tweezers. His elbow knocked against the edge, sending the glass vial tumbling toward the floor. He lunged to catch it, hand brushing the watch casing as he fell. The metal clicked with a sharp mechanical sound that echoed through the stillness. Martin froze, staring at the watch as a small compartment in the back slid open, revealing a hollow space that had been invisible before. Inside lay a single strip of microfilm, curled and fragile. Tonya leaned over, breath catching in her throat. "We missed it," she said, voice barely a whisper. The entire time we were looking at the gears, the truth was hiding in plain sight. Martin picked up the film with trembling fingers, mind already racing through the possibilities of what lay beneath the surface. The game had changed again. Tanya took the film from him, holding it up to the light from the desk lamp. The image that emerged was faint but unmistakable, a recording of a meeting between Rohan and someone she did not recognize, their voices distorted by the low quality of the audio track. "This is new," she said, eyes widening as she scanned the faces. Rohan was meeting with a third party, someone outside the palace. Martin stepped closer, face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. "Whoever this person is," he said, voice low and steady. They knew about the watch. They knew about the poison. The realization settled over them both like a cold fog. The conspiracy was deeper than they had imagined, reaching into corners of the city they had not yet explored. Tanya looked at Martin, resolve hardening her features. "We need to find this they find us." Martin packed his equipment away with practiced efficiency, movements sharp and deliberate. The watch sat on the table, its secret now exposed, but its purpose still unclear. He capped the solvent bottle and placed it back in his kit. Click of the latch sounding final in the quiet room. "We are running out of time," he said, zipping the bag shut. "The killer knows we are close." Tonya nodded, hand resting on the tablet that held the new evidence. She felt a strange sense of dread, feeling they were walking into a trap set by someone who knew their every move. "Let them come," she replied, voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her gut. "We have the film now." Martin looked at her, faint smile touching his lips for the first time in days. "Yes," he said, "but we need to be careful. The next move is theirs." He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, leaving only the glow of the server lights in the distance. Martin's fingers fumbled with the gold casing on the terrace table, applying pressure where the film had emerged before. The metal groaned under his grip, but refused to yield the hidden compartment again. He had dropped it by accident once. Repeating that specific angle of impact felt like trying to catch a falling knife in mid-air. "It is not broken," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow as the monsoon humidity clung to the leather of his jacket. "The mechanism requires a sequence. Push, then twist, then lift." He tried the combination again, harder this time, until the watch slipped from his wet palm and skittered across the stone tiles. Tonya watched him from the railing, her eyes tracking the movement of Meera Singh below in the palace gardens, rather than the detective's struggle with the artifact. The woman stood perfectly still near a cluster of oleander bushes, her posture rigid against the gathering storm clouds. Tonya turned back to the Dumbwaiter shaft behind them, the metal rails cold and slick with condensation. She had already scraped the upper section for residue earlier that week. Now she needed to check the latch mechanism where the powder had transferred during the initial poison delivery. Her swab kit clicked open, the sound sharp in the narrow service corridor. "The alkaloid was here," she said, holding up the sample vial against the dim light filtering from the terrace door. Not on the tray rim this time, but deep in the latch groove. Martin stopped his futile wrestling with the watch and looked over, his face grim as he processed the new data point. "That changes the timeline," he replied, stepping closer to inspect the rusted hinge. If the poison was applied at the latch, someone had to be inside the shaft or reach in from the pantry. The realization tightened the air between them without needing a dramatic pause. Martin walked back to the table and picked up the watch again, this time examining the spring with a magnifying loupe he pulled from his pocket. "I am missing something," he admitted, his voice rougher than usual as frustration mounted. "The sequence must be mechanical, a specific torque." He applied pressure to the crown while rotating the bezel counterclockwise, mimicking the motion of winding a clock that had stopped years ago. Nothing happened. The compartment remained sealed tight against his efforts. Tonya leaned against the doorframe, watching him fail with a calm detachment she reserved for difficult puzzles. "You are forcing it," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Think about how Rohan would have opened it in the dark." She did not offer a solution immediately, letting him wrestle with his own assumptions until he finally set the watch down with a heavy sigh. Outside on the terrace, the first drops of rain began to fall, hitting the stone floor with a sound like tiny pebbles. Tanya moved away from Martin and walked to the edge of the railing, her gaze fixed on Meera Singh in the garden below. The woman had not moved an inch since they arrived. She stood near a patch of wet earth where a velvet jewelry case lay open beside her feet. It was the same empty case that held the bitter almond scent they had found earlier, now exposed to the elements without protection. "She is waiting," Tanya murmured, more to herself than to Martin. "Look at her hands." Meera raised one hand slowly, palm facing outward in a gesture that looked like a wave to an approaching boat. The rain intensified, blurring the view of the garden. "She is not fleeing," Tanya continued, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. "If she had done this, she would be gone by now or hiding inside." She pointed toward Meera's raised hand, which remained frozen in that peculiar pose. "That signal, it matches the maintenance window schedule for the private docks we pulled from Zafar's logs." Martin followed her finger, squinting through the downpour as a small boat cut through the choppy water below the palace walls. The vessel moved with practiced precision, docking exactly where Meera stood, waiting without a word spoken between them. "She is coordinating the extraction," Martin said, his mind racing through the logistics of moving evidence off the island during a storm. "But why wait for us to see it?" Tanya pulled her tablet from her bag and tapped the screen, pulling up the predictive behavioral model that had flagged Meera's movements days ago. The AI had predicted she would remain stationary near the waterline until the maintenance window opened. "The algorithm thought she was stalling," Tanya explained, turning the device so Martin could see the red trajectory lines. "But it wasn't stalling, she was timing the rain." The storm provided cover for the boat to approach without triggering motion sensors on the jetty. Martin looked from the screen to Meera's figure below, his expression hardening as the pieces clicked into a new configuration. "The powder on the rails," he said slowly, connecting the dots with sudden clarity. "It wasn't just about poisoning Rohan, it was about leaving a trail that only made..." Meera lowered her hand as the boat pulled alongside the garden wall, and a figure stepped out to retrieve the empty jewelry case. The exchange happened in seconds, silent and efficient, despite the roar of the rain. Tanya watched the scene unfold with a cold sense of dread, realizing they were watching a ritual rather than a panic escape. "She knew we would be here," she said, her voice dropping as she processed the implication. "She wanted us to see the signal." Martin did not answer immediately. He simply stared at the woman who stood calmly in the storm while her accomplice loaded the case onto the boat. The realization settled over him that they were being played, every move anticipated and countered before it was even made. The rain hammered the terrace tiles, drowning out the sound of the engine as the boat pulled away from the dock. Meera turned and began walking back toward the palace entrance, her steps measured and unhurried, despite the downpour soaking through her silk blouse. Tanya started to move forward, but Martin held up a hand to stop her. "Not yet," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm with sharp authority. "If we go out there now, she walks away." He watched Meera disappear into the shadowed archway of the service entrance, leaving them standing alone on the wet terrace with nothing but questions and a watch that still refused to open. The game had moved again, and they were no longer chasing the killer. They were being led somewhere else entirely. Rain hammered the balcony tiles, turning the jasmine garden below into a blur of green and gray. Martin stood with his back to the storm, studying the weather log on his tablet, while Tanya emerged from the service corridor behind him, her boots leaving wet tracks on the marble floor. She held a scrap of fabric pinned between two fingers, the material damp and smelling faintly of ozone and old grease. The humidity was 85%, Martin said, tapping the screen where a red line spiked against the timeline of Rohan's death. At that saturation, the dermal absorption rate for Veratrine increases by nearly 40%. The rain didn't wash the poison away. He looked up, his pale eyes sharp in the gloom. It activated it. The killer needed the monsoon to make the powder invisible until it was too late. Tanya walked closer, holding out the scrap of velvet. I found this wedged in the Dumbwaiter gears near the third-floor shaft. It matches the lining of Meera's smoking jacket. She paused, her brow furrowing as she examined the texture under the dim emergency light. But there was more. The grease on the rails matched the oil from a specific brand of boat engine, one Zafar. The silence in the room grew heavy as the weight of the realization settled over them both. Martin stared at the weather log, then at the fabric scrap, seeing the full picture of Meera's meticulous planning. She didn't just kill him, he said finally. She engineered the conditions for his death. Tonya stepped closer to the table, her voice dropping as she spoke. And she planned it months in advance. She knew the monsoon schedule, Rohan's habits, even the specific absorption rate of Veratrine. Martin looked up at her, his face grim with understanding. She used science as a weapon. Tonya nodded, her eyes scanning the evidence one last time. The humidity was the trigger, the jacket was the delivery system, and the dumbwaiter was the perfect alibi. Martin set the fabric down on the table, his hand trembling slightly for the first time in days. "We have enough to bring her in," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and triumph. "But she won't confess easily. She's too smart for that." Tonya picked up her tablet again, scrolling through the predictive behavioral model that had flagged Meera's movements weeks ago. "The AI predicted this," she said, pointing to a cluster of data points on the screen. It knew she was planning something, but it couldn't pinpoint what. Martin looked at the screen, his eyes narrowing as he saw the pattern emerge from the noise, because the model didn't account for the weather variable. He turned back to Tonya, his expression hardening with resolve. "We need to confront her with the humidity data and the fabric scrap. She won't be able to explain away the physical evidence." Tonya nodded, closing the tablet case with a decisive snap. "Let's go get her," she said, her voice firm despite the tension in the air. Martin grabbed his leather jacket from the back of the chair, the worn material feeling heavy against his shoulders. "She thinks she's untouchable because she stayed one step ahead of the system." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. But she forgot that rain leaves a trail. Tonya followed him out into the corridor, the sound of her boots echoing against the stone walls as they moved toward the elevator. Martin stood before the server rack in the palace basement, the hum of cooling fans filling the silence like a distant engine. He held the disassembled pocket watch in his gloved hands, the gold casing cold against his palms. The gears inside were not merely broken, they had been filed to specific tolerances. This was no theft for currency. He slid the mainspring into the access port of the terminal, watching the screen flicker with a warning that demanded a physical key. The system rejected his first attempt, flashing red as if mocking his effort. A second try required him to align the minute hand with the lunar phase marker on the dial, a mechanical puzzle designed to resist digital brute force. When the gears finally meshed, a low chime resonated through the room, and the encrypted ledger unspooled across the monitor in streams of green text. The data revealed not just embezzlement, but a complete audit trail of Meera Singh, siphoning funds from the palace trust to cover her own gambling debts, using Rohan as a mule for the transfers. Tonya found Meera in the grand ballroom, standing alone amidst the empty crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. The air smelled faintly of ozone and stale champagne from the previous night's gala. Meera did not turn when Tanya approached, her back rigid against the backdrop of a massive window overlooking the lake. "You have the wrong person," Meera said without turning around, her voice precise as she corrected a speck of dust on her sleeve. "I was in my suite reviewing invoices." Tanya stepped closer, the click of her heels echoing on the marble floor. She held up her tablet, displaying the financial graph that spiraled from Rohan's account directly into Meera's offshore shell. "The invoices were fake," Tanya replied, keeping her tone level and professional, "and the watch wasn't stolen for its gold value." She watched Meera's reflection in the glass, noting how the woman's shoulders tensed slightly before she finally turned to face them. Meera stared at the tablet, her expression unchanging despite the damning evidence glowing on the screen. "Rohan was a thief," she stated flatly, avoiding eye contact with Tanya's steady gaze. "He sold family heirlooms to pay off debts he incurred." The lie hung in the air, thin and brittle as old paper. Tanya did not blink or raise her voice. She simply waited, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for Meera herself. "We know about the Veratrine purchase," Tanya said, stepping into Meera's personal space. "We know you used the humidity to activate the poison on his jacket." Meera took a step back, her heel catching on the rug edge, causing her to stumble slightly before regaining her balance. "You have no proof of delivery," she insisted, her voice rising an octave despite her attempt at composure. "The cameras show I was in the garden." Martin emerged from the service elevator, the pocket watch now connected to a portable drive that flashed with data transfer indicators. He joined Tanya by Meera, his face grim under the harsh ballroom lights. "The cameras were looped," Martin said, holding up the device, "but the mechanical alignment of the gears required a specific sequence only someone who knew the watch's internal history could perform." He looked directly at Meera, his pale blue eyes sharp and unblinking. "Rohan was going to expose you tomorrow morning," he continued, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with fact. "That is why he died tonight." Meera opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, her gaze darting toward the double doors as if calculating an escape route that no longer existed. The realization that she had been outmaneuvered seemed to drain the color from her face. Tanya reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metal clicking softly in the vast emptiness of the room. "You are under arrest for the murder of Rohan Mehta," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative, "and for financial fraud on a massive scale." Meera did not struggle or beg, she simply stood there, staring at the screen where Martin had unlocked the final ledger showing every transaction. Her hands remained at her sides, trembling slightly as the gravity of the situation settled over her. The trap was sprung, and there was no way out. Tanya moved to secure Meera's wrists, the cold steel biting into skin that felt too hot with adrenaline. Just as the cuffs clicked shut, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Zafar Ali burst through the double doors, his shirt disheveled and his face slick with sweat from the humid night air behind him. He ignored the security guards who moved to intercept him, shoving past them to stand before the group. "Wait!" Zafar shouted, his voice rough and desperate. "You have the wrong person." Martin turned slowly, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion. "The ferry logs," Zafar gasped, pointing a shaking finger at Meera. "I saw someone else on the boat that night. Someone who paid me to look away." He looked at Tanya, then at Martin, his eyes wide with panic. It was not just her. The silence returned to the room, heavier this time, as the detectives processed the new variable introduced by the frantic pilot. Tanya paused, one hand still on Meera's arm while the other hovered over the cuffs. She looked from Zafar's desperate face to Meera's cold, unreadable mask. "Who was it?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through Zafar's panic. Zafar hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor before he met Tanya's eyes again. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. "I cannot say," he whispered, shaking his head. "They will kill me if I speak." Martin stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. The ledger on the screen continued to scroll, revealing more secrets with every passing second, but the immediate truth had just become complicated. Meera remained silent, her eyes fixed on Zafar, with a look that was neither fear nor relief, far colder. The ballroom lights flickered as the storm outside intensified, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Martin looked at the screen one last time, then back at the two figures standing before him. The case was not closed, it had only just opened a new door. He signaled to Zafar to step aside, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We will find out who you are protecting," Martin said, his voice steady and final. Tonya guided Meera toward the exit, her grip firm on the suspect's arm. The mechanical gears of the watch still hummed softly in Martin's pocket, a reminder that some secrets were designed to be hidden, while others demanded to be found. As they moved through the dark corridor, the sound of Zafar's heavy Martin paused at the threshold of the ballroom, looking back at the empty space where the confrontation had taken place. The ledger remained on the server screen, a digital monument to corruption that would take days to fully unravel. He touched the pocket watch in his jacket, feeling the cold metal against his chest. The gears inside were silent now, their work done for the moment. Outside, the rain hammered against the palace walls, washing away the dust of the past, but leaving the stains of the present untouched. He turned and walked into the night, the weight of the new mystery settling on his shoulders as he prepared to chase a ghost that Zafar Ali had just named. The wind howled through the narrow streets leading away from the palace, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and ozone. Martin moved quickly, his leather jacket flapping against his legs as he navigated the shadows. Tonya was already ahead, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated with the local station. Zafar followed behind, his steps hesitant and unsure. The trio moved like a single unit bound by a shared purpose and a common enemy that remained unseen. Martin's mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the evidence against the new testimony. One thing was certain, Meera Singh had not acted alone. The gears of the conspiracy were larger than any one person could control. They reached the service vehicle parked in the alleyway, its engine idling with a low rumble that vibrated through the pavement. Martin opened the rear door for Zafar, his expression unreadable as he watched the pilot climb inside. Tonya slid into the front seat, her eyes scanning the road ahead with intense focus. The car lurched forward, merging into the traffic of the city streets. As they drove away from the palace, Martin looked out the window at the fading lights of the Taj Lake Palace. The mystery was far from over, and the night was young. He reached for his radio to request backup, knowing that the hunt for the unknown accomplice had just begun in earnest. The rain intensified as the vehicle sped toward the ferry terminal, the wipers working furiously against the deluge. Inside the car, the silence was thick with unspoken questions and mounting tension. Zafar stared out the window, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights. Martin watched him from the rearview mirror, noting the fear that lingered in his eyes. Tonya drove with precision, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she navigated the slick roads. The city of Udaipur stretched out before them, a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be uncovered. They were chasing a shadow now, and shadows could hide in plain sight. Martin opened his notebook, pen poised over the blank page. He needed to document everything while it was fresh. "Zafar," he said, breaking the silence, "tell us exactly what you saw on that boat." Zafar turned slowly, his eyes meeting Martin's in the mirror. The story he had to tell would change everything they thought they knew about the case. The gears of justice were turning once more, mingled desperate witness. Zafar's claim about a second accomplice hung in the humid air of the service corridor, a loose thread Martin refused to pull just yet. The sapphire sweet balcony waited behind them, sealed by glass and the heavy monsoon dampness that still clung to the stone floor. Tonya adjusted her scarf. the silk damp against her neck, while she watched Meera Singh pace the length of the narrow walkway. Meera moved with a jerky, bird-like energy, her eyes darting between the rain lashing the lake and the detective standing in her path. She wore a pristine linen suit that seemed absurdly dry given the storm outside, yet sweat beaded at her hairline. "You are chasing ghosts," Meera said, her words clipped and precise. The water was too high for a boat to approach without being seen. Martin did not answer immediately. He pulled a small hygrometer from his pocket and held it up against the balcony railing. The needle twitched, settling on a reading that matched the logs from 3 nights ago with terrifying accuracy. "We are not chasing ghosts," he replied, tucking the device away. "We are measuring humidity." The air on the balcony felt thick, almost viscous, pressing against their skin like a warm blanket soaked in water. Martin stepped closer to the railing, his boots making a dull thud on the wet stone. He gestured for Tonya to join him near the corner, where the shadow of the overhang deepened. At 78% saturation, he began, his speaking in a monotone that betrayed nothing, and analytical, Veratrine alkaloid changes its physical state. Tonya nodded, pulling her tablet from her bag, despite the moisture in the air. She tapped the screen, bringing up a graph that spiked sharply during the monsoon peak of that specific night. The line looked like a mountain range carved by a sudden storm. "The powder you placed on the jacket," she said, looking up at Meera with steady, unblinking eyes, "did not activate until the humidity hit that threshold." She paused, letting the data hang between them. It was invisible then. It became lethal only when the rain started. Meera's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath her skin, as she stared out at the dark water. Meera turned away from the lake, her expression hardening into something cold and defensive. She smoothed the front of her jacket with a quick, nervous motion, her fingers trembling slightly before she forced them still. "You are speculating," she declared, her tone rising an octave in irritation. "I was in the garden during that time. The logs confirm my presence." Martin ignored the interruption, his focus fixed on the railing where the metal gleamed wet under the porch lights. He ran a gloved finger along the brass fixture, feeling for residue. It came away with a faint, greasy sheen that smelled of something sharp and chemical, distinct from the river water. "This isn't just rain," he muttered, holding his hand up to catch the light. "This is lubricant, the same compound found in your jewelry case." Tonya shifted his stance, her presence filling the small space between them. She did not need to shout for her voice to cut through Meera's denials. "We know you accessed the Dumbwaiter manually," she said, keeping her tone level but firm. "You bypassed the camera loop because you knew exactly when the system would reboot." The accusation landed with a heavy silence that stretched until the sound of distant thunder rolled across the lake's surface. Meera's composure cracked, just for a second, revealing a flash of raw panic before she masked it with arrogance again. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture that made her look smaller despite her rigid stance. "I am an archivist," she snapped, her eyes darting toward the corridor entrance as if looking for an escape route. "I do not handle poisons." Martin shook his head slowly, a gesture of weary dismissal rather than anger. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of velvet fabric, holding it up against the dim light filtering from the terrace door. It was the same material that had been found in the Dumbwaiter gears, stained with the white residue that now made sense to them both. "You bought enough Veratrine to fill a vial," he said, his voice dropping as he connected the dots. "But you did not need a vial. You needed a delivery system." He tossed the fabric onto the railing, where it landed with a soft thud. "The humidity was your accomplice, Meera. It made the poison invisible until it was too late." Tonya watched Meera's face carefully, reading the subtle shifts in her expression that betrayed her fear. The woman's eyes narrowed as she processed the evidence, her mind racing through options that were rapidly disappearing. "You think this proves anything?" Meera demanded, her voice sharp and brittle. "Anyone could have planted that fabric." Martin turned to look at her, his pale blue eyes sharp with understanding. "Not anyone," he replied. "Only someone who knew the maintenance schedule for the Dumbwaiter shaft." He paused, letting the implication sink in, and only someone who had access to the manual override key. Tanya stepped closer, closing the distance until she could see the sweat beading on Meera's upper lip. She held up her tablet again, displaying a new graph that showed a spike in Meera's movement patterns during the exact window of the murder. "The predictive model flagged you," she said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "You were not just watching the storm, you were waiting for it to start." Meera let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded entirely wrong in the quiet space. She turned away from them both, walking toward the glass doors that led back into the suite. Her movements were stiff, her shoulders hunching as if she carried a heavy, invisible weight. "You are wasting your time," she said without turning around, her voice precise as she corrected a speck of dust on her sleeve. "I have nothing more to say." She reached for the handle, her fingers gripping the cold metal with white-knuckled intensity. Tanya watched her go, but her eyes dropped to the jewelry case Meera held tucked under her arm. It was the same velvet-lined box Martin had seen earlier that day, yet something about its shape seemed slightly off. The small compartment on the side, usually lined with plush fabric, appeared empty now. Martin noticed it too. He exchanged a quick look with Tanya, a silent communication passing between them that spoke of a missing piece of the puzzle. "She took something out," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the case, "right before we walked in." The door clicked shut behind Meera, leaving the detectives alone on the balcony with the sound of rain hammering against the glass, the humidity still pressed against their skin, a physical reminder of the conditions that had turned a harmless powder into a murder weapon. Tanya lowered her tablet, her expression grim as she processed the new variable. "She knew we were coming," she said, turning to face Martin with a frown. That compartment was empty. Martin let the weight of the words settle, his mind already racing through the implications of what Meera had hidden in that space. The ledger from the watch was gone, or at least part of it. "We have the motive," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and triumph. "Now we need to find out who she gave it to." He looked out over the dark lake where the storm raged on without mercy. The second accomplice Zafar had mentioned might not be a ghost after all. They were standing right here, waiting in plain sight. Meera's hand hovered over the jewelry case for a second longer than necessary before she snatched a small velvet pouch and vanished into the corridor. Martin did not chase her immediately. He watched the empty doorway where the scent of ozone and old brass still lingered from the manual override he had just traced on his tablet. The path was clear in the schematics but blocked by grease in reality. They followed the service stairs down, their boots heavy on the concrete steps that smelled of damp rot and cleaning solvent. The air grew colder as they descended toward the sub-basement, where the Dumbwaiter shaft terminated behind a rusted iron door marked with peeling paint. Martin pushed the door open, and the smell of stale oil hit them like a physical blow, thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Tanya clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a narrow maintenance corridor lined with dripping pipes and stacks of linen that had gone soft with age. The service pantry was a labyrinth of stainless steel tables and hanging copper pots that swayed slightly in the draft from the open shaft. Martin moved toward the rear wall where the Dumbwaiter car sat motionless, its metal tray stained with years of grime. He did not need to search far. The manual override key he had seen Meera pocket earlier was a mechanical device, and its purpose here was specific. He knelt beside the car's undercarriage, his fingers probing the grease trap where the guide rails met the floor. His hand closed around something cold and metallic that felt wrong against the sticky residue. He pulled out the pocket watch Rohan had worn on the night he died, its gold casing tarnished by the humidity but intact. The mechanism inside was not just timekeeping, it was a physical decryption key designed to align with the magnetic latch in the shaft's casing. Tanya stood near the entrance of the pantry, her eyes scanning the shadows where Meera had disappeared moments before. She heard the faint creak of a floorboard behind a stack of crates and shifted his stance without hesitation. "You cannot hide in the dark forever," she called out, her voice echoing off the metal walls. The silence that followed was heavy with the sound of dripping water and the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system. A figure emerged from the shadows between two rows of shelving, holding a small flashlight that trembled slightly in her grip. It was Meera Singh, her face pale and drawn, her usual composure fractured by the exhaustion of running a lie across an entire palace. She did not run this time. She simply stood there, clutching the velvet pouch against her chest as if it contained. "You found the watch," Meera stated, her voice precise and devoid of panic despite the situation. "I knew you would follow the mechanical path. The digital logs are a labyrinth, but the gears always tell the truth." Martin stood up slowly, holding the pocket watch in one hand while the other rested near his belt. He did not offer her kindness or leniency. He only offered the cold facts of what had happened to Rohan Mehta. "The watch was never stolen for its gold value," Martin said, stepping closer until they were within arm's reach. "It was the key to your ledger, the one that shows every unauthorized transfer you made from the trust fund over the last 3 years. He tossed the watch onto a nearby table where it landed with a sharp clatter that echoed in the small room. Meera's eyes flickered toward the watch, but she did not move to retrieve it. "Rohan was going to expose everything," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to bitter. "He had the microfilm strip, and he was ready to sell the story to the highest bidder." She paused, correcting herself with a sharp intake of breath. "No, he was going to blackmail me into giving him control of the assets before I could liquidate them." Tonya stepped forward, her presence filling the space between them as she pulled up the financial records on her tablet. "You killed him because he threatened your position," Tonya said, watching Meera's face closely for any sign of a lie. "And you used the humidity to activate the Veratrine powder on his jacket so it would look like an accident." Meera did not deny it. She simply looked away at the rusted pipes overhead. The confession was not a dramatic unraveling, but a cold admission of necessity. Meera explained how she had manipulated the maintenance schedule to ensure the Dumbwaiter was accessible only during the monsoon peak when the humidity would trigger the poison. She had used her status as the head of housekeeping to bypass security and access the shaft without raising alarms. "I did not want him dead," Meera said, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely rose above the dripping water. "But he left me no choice." Martin listened without interrupting, his face unreadable as he processed the details of a crime engineered with surgical precision. The other suspects were cleared by this admission. Vikram's presence in the pantry was merely a coincidence, Ananya's threats were bluster, and Priya's affair was unrelated to the murder. The truth hands. Outside the palace gates, the wail of police sirens cut through the humid night air as the first cruiser turned onto the service road. Martin signaled for Tanya to secure the scene while he walked Meera toward the exit where officers waited with their lights flashing against the dark water of Lake Pichola. She did not struggle or beg. She walked with a stiff, mechanical gait that matched the precision of her crime. "Arjun is already on a boat leaving Udaipur," Meera whispered as they passed through the heavy iron gates, her voice barely audible over the roar of the siren. "He has the original hard drive." Martin stopped and looked back at her, his expression hardening as he realized the game was far from over. The ledger was gone, but the evidence she had confessed to was enough to lock her away for life. The rain began to fall again, washing the grease from the pantry floor as the detective stood in the doorway watching Meera being led into the back of the patrol car. Tonya closed her tablet and slipped it into her bag, the weight of the case finally lifting from her shoulders even if the mystery was not fully resolved. "We have her," she said, turning to Martin with a look that mixed relief with exhaustion. "But we lost Arjun." Martin nodded once. his eyes fixed on the dark water where the boat had disappeared into the storm. "He will come back for the drive," he murmured, the cold logic of the case settling in his mind like a stone dropped in deep water. They had solved the murder, but the conspiracy was still alive and waiting in the shadows. The arrest siren wailed in the distance, a thin, dying sound against the heavy monsoon drumming on the tin roof of the service pantry. Martin stood before the dumbwaiter shaft, the air thick with the smell of wet grease and old copper. He held a small spray bottle containing a chemical reagent, his hand steady despite the humidity that made his shirt cling to his spine. Tanya watched Meera from 3 feet away, her eyes tracking the woman's hands which hovered near the control panel as if itching to delete the final record of her movement. "You cannot destroy the logs now," Martin said, his voice stripped of inflection and precise in the damp room. The reagent misted onto the metal guide rail where a faint iridescent smear still lingered from 3 nights prior. Meera did not flinch. She stared at the wall, her expression unreadable behind a mask of practiced indifference. Martin pressed a button on his handheld spectrometer and waited for the readout to stabilize. The humidity in the room was already high, a natural catalyst that made the chemical reaction faster. He sprayed the rail again, this time targeting a specific scratch near the manual override lever. The metal hissed as the solution touched it, turning a violent, shocking pink within seconds. "Veratrine," Martin stated, looking at Tonya. The powder was applied here, on the rails, not the jacket. He turned back to Meera, holding up the device. "When you opened this box during the maintenance window, your glove brushed against the residue. The humidity of the storm activated it instantly." Meera finally looked at him, her eyes sharp and cold. "I touched nothing," she said, her words clipped and deliberate. "You are mistaken about the timeline." Tonya stepped closer to the control panel, ignoring Meera's denial as she ran her fingers over the surface. She found it immediately, a fresh scratch on the brushed steel that matched the unique facet of Meera's silver ring. The metal was warm from friction, a physical testament to recent force applied against the mechanism. "This scratch is new," Tonya said, holding up her tablet to show the timestamp on the maintenance log. It occurred at 2:14 a.m., exactly when Rohan was dying upstairs. She pointed to the screen where the predictive model had flagged an anomaly in the shaft's movement. "You didn't just watch him die, Meera. You engineered the environment that killed him." Meera's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening until the muscle jumped beneath her skin. "The humidity was high," she corrected, her voice rising slightly. "It is not my fault he wore cotton instead of synthetic fibers." Martin moved to the center of the room, his presence filling the small space with an unyielding authority that demanded silence. He recited the facts without emotion, laying out the entire sequence of events as if reading a court transcript. "You attended the gem exhibition in Jaipur 3 months ago," he said, watching Meera's face for any sign of recognition. "That is where you acquired the Veratrine from a private collector who specialized in rare alkaloids." He paused, letting the specific detail hang in the humid air between them. "Rohan found your ledger. He knew about the embezzlement and the theft of the family heirlooms to cover your debts." Meera looked away, her gaze fixing on the dripping water from a pipe above. "He was blackmailing me," she admitted finally, her voice devoid of regret or remorse. "I had no choice but to silence him before he destroyed everything I built." The confession did not bring relief. It brought only the cold reality of what came next. Martin gave a brief tilt of acknowledgement, signaling Tonya to secure the evidence bag for the control panel. The pink stain on the rail was now a permanent mark of guilt, a chemical signature that no amount of scrubbing could erase. "You used the Dumbwaiter as your delivery system," Martin continued, his voice low and steady. "The grease masked the powder until the moment of contact." He looked at Meera with eyes that held no pity for her desperation or her arrogance. The watch was not stolen for gold. It contained the key to decrypting the offshore accounts you were laundering through the trust fund. Meera laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the metal walls and died quickly in the damp air. "You think I care about money?" she whispered, turning her back on them. "I care about survival." Suddenly, the pocket watch Martin held began to vibrate against his palm, a low hum that grew into a distinct mechanical whirring sound. He looked down just as the casing clicked open with an audible snap, projecting a beam of light onto the steam-filled wall above the sink. A holographic display flickered into existence, showing not bank numbers but a live countdown timer ticking down in red digits against a backdrop of global financial data. The timer read 001459 and was decreasing rapidly. "What is that?" Tanya asked, her voice sharp with sudden alarm as she stepped closer to the projection. Martin stared at the floating numbers, realizing the watch was not just a key, but an active trigger for a massive fund transfer. The countdown had started the moment Meera confessed, or perhaps the moment the humidity reached its peak threshold in the room. Meera spun around, her face draining of color as she saw the hologram glowing against the wet tiles. "No!" she gasped, her composure shattering completely into panic. "You have to stop it!" She lunged toward the projection, her hands reaching for the light as if she could physically grab the data and pull it back from the void. Martin caught her arm before she could touch the wall, his grip iron tight against her trembling wrist. "It is too late to stop," he said, watching the timer drop below 10 minutes with a cold sense of dread settling in his gut. The numbers scrolled faster now, a cascade of zeros that represented millions moving across borders in seconds. Tanya pulled out her tablet, frantically trying to trace the signal path. But the encryption was already locking down. "We have 9 minutes," she said, looking up at Martin with wide eyes. 9 minutes before the money vanishes forever. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic dripping of water and the frantic ticking of the digital clock projected on the wall. Meera struggled against Martin's hold, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the countdown. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear that stripped away her carefully constructed persona. "I did not know," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the impending loss. "The protocol. It activates only when the humidity triggers the final lock." Martin let go of her arm and stepped back, watching the timer tick down with a grim realization. They had solved the murder, but they had missed the true objective until the very end. The poison was just the distraction. The watch was the weapon. As the numbers hit 000500, Martin looked at Tonya and saw the same thought reflected in her eyes. They were too late to save the money, but perhaps not too late to catch the one person who would benefit from its arrival.